Can we have your leftovers?
How long has it been since you ate?
Long enough.
Stay behind me, kids.
Grease popped and sizzled on the dented hot plate, smelling of burnt copper. He just wanted a quiet meal. Then came a small, trembling voice cutting right through the cantina's noise. "Can we have your leftovers?" He almost ignored it, until he looked up and saw those impossible, piercing blue eyes. Dean chewed his synthesized pork slowly, letting the salty, ash-like grit grind between his molars. It tasted terrible. It always tasted terrible. Out here on the outer rim of the Corvus sector, 100 light years from any planet that possessed actual soil, real food was a myth. You ate for calories. You ate to keep your muscles from cannibalizing themselves. The cantina, locally known as the sump, vibrated with the heavy, rhythmic thrum of the station's atmospheric scrubbers. It was a miserable sound that rattled the fillings in Dean's teeth. The air tasted of battery acid, stale alcohol, and the ammonia-rich sweat of a dozen different alien species crammed into a room meant for half that number. To his left, two massive, chitinous Viscari were clacking their mandibles over a game of chance. To his right, a cluster of four-eyed merchants bartered in guttural, wet clicks that made Dean's skin crawl. Dean swallowed the dry paste and washed it down with a swig of tepid water from a scratched composite glass. His knuckles ached. The dull throb in his right knee, a souvenir from a skirmish on an ice mining rig a decade ago, flared up with every vibration of the floor plates. He was 46, but his body felt like it had been dragged behind a freighter for 6 decades. He wanted to finish his plate, walk back to his ship, and sleep for 3 days. A shadow fell over his sticky, knife-scarred table. Dean didn't look up. He kept his eyes locked on the gray-brown slab of protein sitting in a pool of synthetic grease. Experience had taught him that making eye contact in the sump was an invitation for a shakedown, a sales pitch, or a knife in the ribs. "Move along," Dean said, his voice low, gravelly, and scraped dry by recycled oxygen. The shadow didn't move. In fact, it multiplied. Dean caught the shift in the dim yellow lighting. Not one shadow, but 4. Small, standing far too close. A sharp, unpleasant smell cut through the cantina's usual stench of ammonia and ozone. It was the smell of unwashed hair, dried mud, and copper. It was a distinctly mammalian scent, devoid of the chemical undertones most station dwellers carried. "Can we have your leftovers?" The voice was tiny. It cracked on the last syllable, breathless and strained. Dean froze. His heavy metal fork paused halfway to his mouth. That wasn't a universal translator flattening alien syntax into standardized galactic standard. That was raw, unmodulated vocal cord vibration. English. He lowered his fork. The metal clinked sharply against the ceramic plate. He sighed, a slow exhale of pure, condensed exhaustion, and finally dragged his gaze upward. 4 figures stood huddled by the edge of his booth. They were wrapped in oversized, filthy rags, scraps of thermal lining, and torn environment suits that looked like they had been scavenged from a blast zone. Their faces were smeared with dark grease and rust dust. The one who had spoken stood slightly ahead of the others. A boy, maybe 10 or 11 years old, his bony shoulders rigid beneath a heavy, stained canvas jacket. Behind him, clutching the back of his coat, was a smaller boy. Next to them stood a girl with matted brown hair, her arm wrapped protectively around a toddler whose face was completely buried in her side. Dean stared at the oldest boy's face. The dirt was thick, but underneath the grime, the features were undeniably human. But it was the eyes that hit Dean like a physical blow to the sternum. Blue. Not the pale, milky blue of a blind alien ocular implant, not the iridescent, shifting blue of a deep space cephalopod. It was a piercing, vivid human blue, the color of an Earth sky Dean hadn't seen in 22 years. Dean's stomach twisted into a tight, cold knot. Humans didn't come to Corvus. Humans were a myth out here. A distant, violent rumor of hairless apes from a high-gravity death world near the galactic core. The few humans who did wander this far out were hardened mercenaries, deep-cover syndicates, or corpses. Kids didn't exist out here. Human kids especially. "Where did you come from?" Dean asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't want the surrounding tables to hear. The boy didn't answer. His blue eyes darted from Dean's face to the half-eaten slab of synth pork on the plate. The boy swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed in a neck so thin it looked like a stiff breeze would snap it. Dean could hear the faint, erratic wheeze of the youngest child's breathing. They were starving. Not hungry. Starving. The boy's gaze flicked back up to Dean's eyes. There was terror there, absolute and paralyzing, but it was being violently suppressed by an overriding, animalistic need for calories. "Please," the boy whispered, his cracked lips barely moving. "Just whatever you don't want." Dean felt a sudden, ugly surge of anger. He wasn't a savior. He was a low-tier freight hauler hiding from his own debts, and a past he had drank half his liver away trying to forget. He looked at the 4 emaciated human children standing in a cantina filled with beings who would sell them to a biological research lab for the price of a pint of engine coolant. "Walk away," a cynical voice in his head hissed. "Pay your tab. Walk away. If you acknowledge them, they're yours. You can barely feed yourself." Dean looked at his plate. The synth pork had gone cold. The grease was congealing into a pale, sickening paste. He looked back at the boy. The kid's hands were shaking, tremors of advanced malnutrition. Dean closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, hating himself. He hated his own weakness. He hated the galaxy. Most of all, he hated that pair of blue eyes dragging his buried conscience back to the surface. He didn't say a word. He just placed his hand on the edge of the plate and shoved it across the sticky table until it stopped at the very edge, right in front of the boy. The reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. There was no hesitation, no polite gratitude. The boy didn't even pick up the fork. He lunged forward, his filthy, soot-stained fingers grabbing the congealed slab of synthetic meat. He tore it in half with a savage twist of his wrists. He didn't eat it himself. He shoved the largest chunk into the hands of the younger boy behind him, then ripped the remaining piece, pressing a portion into the girl's hands. The little girl immediately broke her piece, chewing up a small morsel in her own mouth before pulling the toddler closer and pressing the softened food past the small child's lips. Only then did the oldest boy lick the remaining grease and crumbs from his own fingers, his chest heaving. Dean sat back in his booth, feeling sick. He watched them devour the garbage food like it was a banquet. They didn't chew properly. They swallowed in heavy, painful gulps, their throats working desperately. It was raw. It was feral. It was the behavior of cornered prey that had been pushed past the breaking point of human dignity. "Don't eat so fast," Dean muttered, keeping his voice low. "You'll throw it back up." The oldest boy froze, licking a speck of grease from his thumb. His blue eyes snapped to Dean, wide and feral, like a stray dog expecting a kick. He didn't drop the crumbs. A heavy, wet thud vibrated through the floorboards behind the kids. Dean's spine stiffened. The ambient noise of the cantina seemed to dip. Well, look what the ventilation ducts coughed up. The voice sounded like rocks grinding in a rusted blender. A foul stench washed over the table, rotting fruit and heavy sulfur. Dean shifted his weight, letting his right hand drop casually below the table, his fingers brushing the cold, textured grip of the kinetic pistol holstered at his thigh. A Craxian enforcer loomed over the children. The alien stood 7 feet tall, covered in thick, dark green scales that oozed a faint, toxic mucus. 4 yellow, slit-pupiled eyes glared down at the huddled group. The Craxian worked for the local syndicate. They ran the docks, they ran the sump, and they collected stray biologicals for the flesh markets. The children instantly shrunk in on themselves. The oldest boy stepped backward, pushing his siblings behind him, his small shoulders trembling so violently Dean could hear the fabric of his jacket rustling. "I wondered where the little squeakers crawled off to," the Craxian rumbled, a thick glob of saliva dripping from its jaw and sizzling on the metal floor. One massive, clawed hand reached out toward the little girl. "The foreman will pay a week's wage for the rare meat. Exotic. High-gravity bones. Don't do it," Dean's internal voice screamed. "Shoot the ceiling, cause a distraction, and run." Let the station security handle it. It is not your problem. Dean looked at the oldest boy. The kid had picked up the blunt metal fork from the table. He was holding it tightly, positioning himself between the massive, armored alien and his sister. A 10-year-old boy, weighing maybe 60 pounds, preparing to fight a 500-pound reptilian enforcer with a dining utensil. The utter, stupid, human defiance of it broke whatever restraint Dean had left. As the Craxian's hand closed around the little girl's hood, Dean moved. He didn't shout. He didn't issue a warning. Heroic speeches wasted oxygen and gave the enemy time to react. Dean surged out of the booth, his heavy combat boot kicking the table upward. The heavy metal table slammed into the Craxian's knees, forcing the alien to stagger backward. In the same fluid motion, Dean drew his kinetic pistol, bringing the heavy, squared-off barrel directly up and beneath the Craxian's jaw. "Let go of the fabric," Dean said. His voice was completely flat. No anger, no bravado, just the dead, heavy tone of a man who had killed before and was merely doing the math on doing it again. The cantina went dead silent. The clacking mandibles of the Vascari stopped. The hum of the air scrubbers felt deafening. The Craxian froze. It looked down, its 4 eyes focusing on the human pressing a high-velocity firearm into the softest part of its neck. "You are out of your jurisdiction, ape," the Craxian hissed, the sulfur smell thickening. "These are unchipped strays, syndicate property by salvage rights." "They're my cargo," Dean lied, pushing the barrel up a fraction of an inch, digging it past the scales. "Little runaways, got out of my hold. You touch my cargo, I blow your brainstem out through the top of your skull." The Craxian's eyes narrowed. "You're a long way from the core, human. You pull that trigger, the whole station comes down on you." "Maybe," Dean said, "but you'll be dead. Are you willing to die for a week's wages?" The standoff dragged on for 3 agonizing seconds. Dean's shoulder ached. His knee throbbed. He could feel the cold sweat beating on the back of his neck. He was old, and he was tired. And if this went to a shootout, he wasn't sure he was fast enough to drop the alien before it ripped his head off. Slowly, the Craxian released the girl's hood. The alien took a deliberate step back, raising its 3-fingered hands in a gesture of mock surrender. "Keep your trash, ape. But they better have boarding passes before the cycle ends, or the syndicate will just scrape you all off the deck plates." The Craxian spat on the floor near Dean's boots and lumbered away, pushing roughly past a group of frightened merchants. The tension in the cantina slowly dissolved into a nervous murmur as patrons deliberately looked away, returning to their drinks. Nobody wanted to be a witness. Dean let out a slow, controlled breath and holstered his weapon. His hands were shaking. He hated that. He turned to the bartender, an 8-limbed cephalopod watching from behind the counter. Dean tossed a solid silver credit chit onto the spilled grease of his table. It was enough to cover his meal and buy an hour of selective amnesia. He looked down at the kids. They were staring at him. The oldest boy still held the fork, though the tip was pointing at the floor now. "Don't just stand there," Dean rasped, rubbing his aching temple. "Are you trying to get butchered? Move." He turned and started walking toward the cantina's exit. He didn't look back to see if they were following. He just listened. Behind him, over the hum of the station, he heard the soft, rapid scuffing of 4 pairs of ragged shoes hurrying to keep pace with his heavy boots. The lower decks of Kalen Prime were a nightmare of exposed pipes, dripping coolant, and dim, flickering halogen tubes. The air was colder down here, smelling sharply of ozone and rusted iron. It was the industrial gut of the station, a labyrinth of maintenance shafts and secondary cargo bays where the destitute and the desperate scraped by. Dean walked with a fast, heavy limp, his hand resting instinctively near his holster. The corridors were mostly empty, save for a few mechanical scrubber drones humming mindlessly along the grating. Every shadow felt like an ambush waiting to spring. He kept his ears tuned to the sounds behind him. The kids were incredibly quiet. They didn't chatter, they didn't complain, and they didn't cry. They moved with a grim, synchronized efficiency that made Dean's stomach churn. Children weren't supposed to move like that. They moved like a seasoned infantry squad navigating a minefield. When Dean paused at an intersection to check for foot traffic, the scuffing stops immediately. When he stepped forward, they stepped forward. He glanced over his shoulder. The oldest boy, still gripping the metal fork from the cantina like a combat knife, walked point. He was ushering the younger ones along, his blue eyes constantly scanning the pipes and dark alcoves. The girl was practically dragging the toddler, but none of them made a sound. "Keep up," Dean grunted, immediately regretting the harshness in his tone, though he didn't soften it. He needed them moving. "We're almost to the dock. Where are you taking us?" The boy's voice was hoarse. It was the first time he had spoken since the cantina. "To my ship," Dean replied without looking back. "Before the syndicate sends a cleanup crew to find us." They turned a corner into a wide, metallic corridor lined with heavy airlock doors. Above one of the massive bulkheads, a rusted sign painted in Gal Standard and English read, "Bay 4, Private Craft." Dean pressed his palm against the biological scanner next to the door. The machine whirred. A green light flashed, and heavy pneumatic locks disengaged with a deafening clank. The heavy steel door slid open, groaning on neglected tracks. The inside of the bay was dimly lit, revealing the battered, heavily modified hull of Dean's freighter, the Corvus. It was a wedge-shaped hunk of scarred gray armor plating, covered in scorch marks, micrometeorite dents, and patchy weld jobs. It was ugly, slow, and smelled permanently of old engine oil, but it was thick-skinned. Dean walked up the loading ramp, punching a code into the ship's exterior keypad. The interior airlock hissed, blowing a warm gust of air outward. "Get in," Dean ordered. The kids hesitated at the bottom of the ramp. The dark interior of an unknown ship, piloted by an armed stranger, wasn't exactly an inviting prospect. "Listen to me," Dean said, turning around. He leaned against the bulkhead, crossing his arms. He looked at the boy. "That Craxian back there wasn't joking. You don't have tags. You don't have syndicate protection. On this station, that means you're spare parts. If you stay out here, you're dead. If you come inside, I'll lock the door, and nobody touches you. Make a choice." The boy stared at Dean. Those bright, unnatural blue eyes searched the older man's scarred, exhausted face. Whatever the kid was looking for, he apparently found it. Or maybe he just realized he was out of options. The boy nodded once. He grabbed his younger brother's shoulder and pushed him up the ramp. The girl followed with the toddler. Finally, the boy stepped inside. Dean hit the button. The heavy ramp retracted with a hydraulic whine, sealing shut and plunging the airlock into darkness before the interior cabin lights flickered on. The air inside the Corvus was warm. It smelled of stale coffee, copper wiring, and the distinct, dusty scent of heated metal. To Dean, it was the smell of isolation. To the kids, it seemed to be the smell of heaven. The moment the outer door locked, the tension visibly drained from their bodies. The little girl collapsed to her knees on the metal grating, pulling the toddler into her lap, her breathing slowing down. Dean walked past them into the small galley. He opened a reinforced cabinet and pulled out 4 silver packets of emergency hydration fluid and a stack of high-density caloric bars. They were dry and tasted like chalk, but they wouldn't shock a starving system the way the grease in the cantina had. He walked back and dropped the rations onto a small, bolted-down metal table. "Drink the water first," Dean instructed. "Slowly. Then eat." They didn't need to be told twice. The crinkle of foil packets filled the silence. They drank with desperate focus. Dean sank into a worn leather pilot's chair opposite the table, groaning as his bad knee finally bent. He pulled a rag from his pocket and wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. He looked at the 4 runaways. They were so small. They looked like they belonged on a farm or in a schoolyard, not stranded in the armpit of the galaxy. "All right," Dean said, his voice softer now that the adrenaline was fading. "Who are you? And how the hell did 4 human kids get to Kalen Prime?" The oldest boy finished his water. He set the empty pouch down, his hands trembling slightly. Though this time Dean suspected it was from the sudden rush of safety, rather than starvation. "I'm Leo," the boy said. His voice was steadier now, though still hoarse. He pointed to the younger boy. "That's Sam. He's 9. Maya is 7. The baby is Toby. He's 3. Dean rubbed his eyes. Okay, Leo. Where are your parents? Leo looked down at the table. His jaw tightened. A muscle fluttered near his ear. The silence stretched out, heavy and suffocating. Before the boy finally looked back up, the vulnerability in his eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, hardened slate that sent a chill down Dean's spine. They're dead, Leo stated. It wasn't a lament. It was a tactical report. I'm sorry, Dean stammered, caught off guard by the sheer detachment in the child's tone. How did you get here? Kalen Prime is light years from any human settlement. We didn't come here on purpose, Leo said, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of the metal table. We lived on Aegis 4. It was a farming colony. 6 months ago, the sky went black. Slavers, Vascari, and Craxian syndicates. They burned the fields. They rounded everyone up. Dean's blood ran cold. Aegis 4. He knew of it. A small, unsanctioned pioneer settlement just outside the designated human expansion zone. Easy pickings for alien syndicates looking for illegal, biological commodities. They packed us into a hauler, Leo continued, his voice monotone, reciting the nightmare like he had memorized it. 300 of us, mostly kids and women. They were taking us to the deep core markets. But their ship was old. The life support failed in the lower holds. Leo stopped. He looked over at Maya, who had fallen asleep against the bulkhead, clutching half a ration bar. A lot of people died in the dark, Leo whispered. Then, the ship's navigation failed. We crashed on the dark side of a moon a few systems over from here. A crash? Dean leaned forward, his brow furrowed. A syndicate slaver ship crashes. The syndicates send a recovery team. How did you escape? The crew died, Leo said. In the crash? No. Leo looked up, his blue eyes locking onto Dean's. The crash didn't kill them. The cold did. It was minus 60 degrees outside the hull. The Craxian scales froze and cracked. The Vascari went into hibernation and never woke up. They aren't built for the cold. Dean stared at him, the horrifying reality dawning on him. The beacon was destroyed, Leo said, his small hands clenching into fists. Nobody came. We waited for a week. The food ran out. So, my dad told us we had to walk. There was an automated mining outpost 400 miles away, according to the ship's charts. 400 miles? Dean whispered, his mind rejecting the mathematics. In negative 60 degrees? With no life support? We are human, Leo said, as if that explained everything. And in a terrifying, profound way, it did. My dad wrapped us in the thermal insulation from the ship's bulkheads. We walked for 30 days. The aliens died in their sleep on the first night. We just kept walking. The boy's voice finally cracked, a microscopic fracture in his armor. My parents gave us their rations. They stopped walking on day 28. They told us to keep following the stars. We reached the outpost. Smuggled ourselves onto an automated ore freighter headed for this station. We've been hiding in the vents here for 2 weeks. Dean sat completely paralyzed in his chair. He looked at the 4 filthy, emaciated children. The galaxy viewed humans as violent, hairless apes. They thought humans were primitive because they didn't have elegant psionic abilities or naturally armored exoskeletons. But the galaxy didn't understand the terrifying, relentless endurance of the human body. They didn't understand an evolutionary line built on sweating, bleeding, and simply outlasting death itself. 4 kids, 400 miles, across a frozen wasteland that killed an entire crew of heavily armored alien slavers in a single night. Dean looked at Leo. He saw the sheer, indomitable willpower radiating from a 10-year-old boy who had marched through hell and kept his siblings alive against impossible odds. Dean swallowed the lump forming in his dry throat. He stood up slowly, the joints in his knees popping. "All right," Dean said softly. He walked over to the ship's main console and flipped the primary ignition switch. The deck plates vibrated as the fusion drive hummed to life. "Buckle in, Leo. Get your siblings in the crash webbing." Leo stood up, his eyes widening slightly. "Where are we going?" Dean pulled his heavy leather jacket tight around his shoulders and locked his eyes on the viewport, staring out at the heavy steel blast doors of the hangar. "I'm taking you home," Dean said. "And if any syndicate ship tries to stop us, I'll show them exactly why they should be terrified of humans." Klaxons blared as Dean bypassed the standard pre-flight checks. He slammed his palm against the auxiliary power overrides. Dust shook loose from the ceiling grating, snowing down onto the scarred control console. The Corvus grumbled. An old beast forced awake too quickly. "Strap them in tight, Leo," Dean yelled over his shoulder, his fingers dancing across a battered keypad. 5-point harnesses. Pull the yellow straps until they click twice. Do not let them loose. Leo didn't waste breath replying. Dean heard the sharp, metallic snaps of the crash webbing engaging. He glanced at the rear monitor. The 10-year-old was moving with frantic precision, securing his little brother and sister, before finally locking himself into the oversized navigator's chair behind Dean. "Done," Leo rasped. "Good. Hold on to your stomach." A harsh, electronic screech erupted from the comms array. The primary display flickered, resolving into the scaled, mucus-slicked face of the Craxian from the cantina. The alien's slit eyes were dilated in predatory anger. "Ape," the Craxian hissed, the translation software struggling to filter the guttural clicks beneath his voice. "Docking clamps are locked. You are in violation of syndicate salvage laws. Power down your drive, or we will vent your bay." Dean didn't reach for the comms button. He reached for the heavy brass lever that controlled the magnetic landing gear. "Venting the bay takes 3 minutes, Dean muttered to himself. "I only need 10 seconds. He yanked the lever backward. Sparks showered from the console. Underneath them, the ship's hull groaned violently as the docking clamps fought the sudden, massive surge of the fusion thrusters. The Corvus was not an elegant ship. It was essentially a flying anvil strapped to an industrial mining engine. Dean gripped the yoke, his knuckles turning white. He felt the exact moment the station's safety interlocks failed. With a deafening crack that reverberated through the marrow of Dean's bones, the Corvus tore free. The ship lunged forward, scraping heavily against the hangar bay ceiling. A horrific squeal of tearing metal echoed through the cabin as the ship's armored spine sheared through Kalen Prime's atmospheric doors. Sudden, violent decompression sucked the remaining air out of the bay behind them, spitting the heavy freighter out into the cold, black vacuum of space. Dean instantly routed power to the rear deflectors. "Talk to me, Leo. Are you all in one piece?" "Maya is crying." Leo's voice came through the internal comms, tight and strained. "But we're locked in. Tell her to keep crying. It means her lungs are working." Dean's eyes darted across the sensor readouts. The cold, empty expanse of the Corvus sector stretched out before them, a hard, unforgiving starfield. But it wasn't empty. 3 red triangles pinged on the peripheral radar, burning hot and fast. "Syndicate cutters," Dean growled. He tasted old copper and stale coffee in the back of his throat. They were waiting on the perimeter. The Corvus was built for hauling heavy, volatile cargo through asteroid fields. It had armor thick enough to survive a direct impact from a rogue comet, but it handled like a brick swimming through molasses. The cutters behind them were the exact opposite. Fragile, insectoid ships designed for terrifying straight-line speed and overwhelming energy fire. A blinding flash of purple plasma splashed against the Corvus's aft shields. The entire ship shuddered. Collision alarms joined the klaxons, creating a deafening cacophony of incoming death. "Shields at 70%, Dean grunted, his bad knee throbbing in time with the ship's violent vibrations. He diverted life support from the cargo hold to boost the generators. It wouldn't be enough. The cutters were too fast. They would chew his engines to slag before he could calculate a slipspace jump. He needed time. He needed distance. He looked at the digital readout for the ship's inertial dampeners. It was a safety system standard on every ship in the galaxy, designed to keep fragile alien bodies from turning to jelly during high-speed maneuvers. Most species maxed out at 4 or 5 Gs before their internal fluid sacs ruptured, or their chitinous shells cracked under their own weight. Humans were different. Humans evolved on a planet that constantly tried to crush them, freeze them, and tear them apart. A high-gravity rock. Dean reached out and flipped the dampener safety switch to manual. "Leo," Dean yelled, his voice carrying a deadly, terrifying calm. "Tell everyone to close their eyes. Push your heads back against the seats. Hard. Do not lean forward. You are going to feel very heavy." "What are you doing?" Leo asked, a spike of genuine panic finally breaking through his stoic facade. "I'm going to show them how humans fly," Dean said. Deep space offered no friction, but the sudden deceleration felt like hitting a concrete wall. Dean cut the main thrusters and slammed the starboard maneuvering jets to maximum override. Without the inertial dampeners softening the blow, the physical backlash was instantaneous and brutal. 9 Gs of force slammed into the cabin. Dean's vision immediately tunneled, the edges bleeding into a fuzzy, static gray. His chest felt like a cinder block had been dropped onto his ribcage. The air was forcefully squeezed from his lungs in a ragged gasp. Behind him, he heard a sickeningly heavy thud as the sudden gravity pinned the children deep into the crash webbing. Toby let out a high, thin wail that was abruptly cut off by the sheer pressure. The Corvus spun violently on its horizontal axis, drifting backward at breakneck speed while its nose swung 180 degrees to face their pursuers. The 3 Syndicate cutters shot past them, their pilots completely unable to comprehend the maneuver. To their computer-assisted, biologically fragile minds, a ship of that mass attempting an undampened reverse drift was suicide. The resulting G-force should have liquefied the pilot in his chair. By the time the alien pilots realized the human was still conscious, it was too late. Dean tasted blood. He had bitten through the inside of his cheek. His hands felt like they weighed 100 pounds each, but muscle memory and decades of pure, stubborn survival instinct forced his fingers to close around the firing trigger of the ship's dorsal railgun. He didn't rely on the targeting computer. He relied on the organic, predatory geometry wired into his primate brain. He led the target, exhaled his remaining breath, and pulled the trigger. A 300-pound slug of depleted uranium accelerated to a fraction of the speed of light. It didn't burn. It didn't flash. It simply existed in the barrel, and a millisecond later, it existed inside the engine block of the lead Syndicate cutter. Space didn't carry the sound of the explosion, but the visual was magnificent. The cutter shattered into a cloud of glowing, expanding debris, its fragile hull peeling apart like wet paper. The remaining 2 cutters immediately broke formation, scattering in opposite directions. They didn't return fire. They didn't try to loop back. They ran. They had just witnessed a biological impossibility, and the predatory math of the Syndicate dictated that you do not engage an anomaly. Dean's trembling hand reached up and re-engaged the inertial dampeners. The crushing weight vanished in an instant, replaced by the gentle, artificial gravity of the cabin. Dean slumped forward over the yoke, gasping for air. His chest heaved. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes and mixing with the blood trickling from his mouth. The silence in the cockpit was absolute, broken only by the steady, rhythmic thrum of the cooling railgun and the quiet hum of the life support systems. Slowly, painfully, Dean unbuckled his harness and forced himself to stand. His bad knee almost gave out, sending a sharp, electrical spike of agony up his thigh. But he caught himself on the back of his chair. He turned around. His heart stopped for a fraction of a second. The kids were slumped in their seats, completely motionless. "Leo," Dean rasped, his voice trembling. He took a stumbling step forward. "Leo, answer me." The oldest boy's head lolled slightly. Then, slowly, his eyelids fluttered. He dragged his head off the headrest, blinking away the disorientation. His face was pale, his lips slightly blue. But he looked up at Dean. "Did?" Leo coughed, his voice barely a whisper. "Did we hit something?" Dean let out a breath that sounded like a sob. He leaned against the bulkhead, closing his eyes for a long moment, as a profound, overwhelming sense of relief washed over him. He looked at the others. Sam was groaning, rubbing his neck. Maya was hyperventilating slightly, but she was alive, her arms still locked tightly around the toddler. Toby, who was finally starting to cry, a loud, angry, healthy sound that Dean had never been so happy to hear. They survived it. They took 9 Gs to the chest without specialized pressure suits, and they survived it because they were forged from the gravity of Earth. "No, kid," Dean said softly, pushing himself off the wall. He walked over and gently checked the straps on Maya's harness. "We didn't hit anything. We just hit the brakes." Dean limped back to the pilot's chair. He reached out and punched the coordinates for the Sol system into the navigation computer. He hadn't inputted those numbers in over 2 decades. He had spent half his life running away from his own failures, hiding in the dark corners of the galaxy where nobody cared if he drank himself to death. He looked at the cracked rearview monitor. Leo was unbuckling his harness, reaching over to comfort his little sister. The boy's hands were steady. He wasn't crying. He was just doing what needed to be done. Dean realized with a strange, heavy clarity that he wasn't running anymore. He was hauling cargo, the most valuable cargo in the universe. "Strap back in, Leo," Dean commanded, his voice losing its raspy edge, replaced by something solid, something grounded. "Are they coming back?" Leo asked, his blue eyes locking onto the monitor. "No," Dean said. He gripped the hyperdrive throttle. They just learned the golden rule of the outer rim. Dean pushed the throttle forward. The stars outside the viewport stretched into long, blinding lines of white light as the Corvus tore a hole in the fabric of space and slipped through. Never corner a human. That concludes Dean's absolutely harrowing escape. If your heart was pounding during that intense 9G maneuver, and you love seeing humanity's raw, unstoppable endurance outsmart the galaxy's absolute worst, smash that like button right now. Share this video with anyone who loves gritty, HFY sci-fi stories where humans prove they are the apex predators. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next epic sci-fi adventure. What should Dean do next? Comment your thoughts below.